evening, everybody. I'm Zelda Richwine, and I'm a very grateful member of the Worldwide Fellowship of Al-Anon Family Groups. My home group is the Midtown group that meets on Tuesday night in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I want to tell you, I got a flu shot on Tuesday. And by that evening, I started getting a scratchy throat. And by Friday, I totally had lost my voice. And I've been gargling with salt water to try to get a voice to be here tonight. So bear with me. If my voice cracks or I lose certain words, I will do my best. And I've asked my higher power to do the talking through me. So it's his voice that's cracking. My responsibility here tonight is to tell you what I was like, what happened, and what I'm like today. And I did not grow up with alcoholism, so I had no knowledge of drinking or alcoholics. I grew up as a Southern Baptist. I come from a very large family. There were 10 of us kids. My very earliest memory was that somehow I had messed up the family. I'm the 7th child, and my family had gone boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, girl. Anyway, 6 of them, and then I was followed a girl. So my older brothers told me that I had screwed up the family, that I was supposed to be a boy. Because then, it threw it off balance. There are 6 girls and 4 boys. And there wasn't anything I could do about that. But I grew up in a family with lots of children. And we lived on a farm. And everybody had a responsibility. I learned very early that I was to uphold my responsibility. We all had jobs. Oftentimes my job was filling the kerosene lantern. And if I did not, then we didn't have any light in the evening. The farm I grew up on was in rural Kansas. There was no electricity. There was no running water. We chopped wood, carried water. We had vegetable gardens, provided for our own vegetables, and pretty much lived off that farm. It was a good way to grow up. I was taught responsibility. I didn't know that by learning that responsibility that I would carry that into meeting an alcoholic and marrying an alcoholic and take that responsibility seriously, including taking somebody else's responsibility away from them. I grew up on that farm till I was about 12 years old, and we moved moved into town. I thought town was heaven. We had running water. We had a bathroom indoors. I spent hours in the bathtub. I didn't mind doing dishes because we had running water, hot. I worked early. I started working first as a babysitter and then as a dishwasher in a restaurant. And so I earned my own money and I bought my own clothes. And in the restaurant, I worked there the summer between my junior and senior year of high school. During that summer, I would go to the local swimming pool during the daytime, and then I would go and work the evening shift. And at the swimming pool, first part of July, there was a young man that would come to that pool, and he got my attention, and he got everybody's attention. He was not from that community, so he did things differently. He would walk around the pool on his hands, and he would walk up the diving board steps into the deep end of the pool, up on that diving board, and he would dive from a handstand into the pool. So it was obvious everybody's going to be watching him. It was like he's from the circus or something. But there was something different about me watching him. I watched him for days. And then one day I got the idea that I would swim over close to where he was sitting on the edge of the pool. And maybe he would talk to me. So I swam over there and I started treading water. And I treaded water and treaded water. I did that so long and he never said a word. And I felt like a fool. I remember thinking, I just got to go away. He's not talking to me, this is a mistake. And so I swam away. Later, when I left the pool that day, I was about a half a block from the pool, and I turned and looked back. And he waved at me. Now, I thought, okay. He actually acknowledged me. I didn't understand what his thing was, why he couldn't talk. So I returned back to the pool. He didn't speak to me. And I went on to work, and then a few weeks later, I was at work, and he came into where I worked, and he ordered a meal, and then he did sign language through the window where you take the orders, asking to drive me home that night. And I just kind of shrugged my shoulders. I don't know. But he came around the back of the restaurant and he asked what time I got off, and I told him 11:30. And so he said he'd be there to drive me home. I didn't know if he would be, but he did. He showed up. But he showed up with another guy in the car. My 17th birthday was the night before. He showed up at the restaurant. I got off work. I got in the car. He drove me straight home, got out and walked me to the door, said goodnight, and went back to the car. And I didn't know what was wrong with this guy. I dated before, and usually people talked. But the next morning, my mother said, "Who drove you home last night?" And usually it was one of the girls at the restaurant would drive me home. And I said, it was a guy that I'd seen at the swimming pool. I met there, and she said, well, he was drinking. I said, I don't think so. She said, well, there's 2 empty bottles of beer on the curb. I went, I didn't know he was drinking. Looking back, though, I know that he needed that liquid courage to be able to ask to drive me home. That buddy, when he had walked me to the door of the trailer, the buddy had set the 2 empty bottles of beer out on the curb. And then when they left, they were left sitting there. So through my senior year of high school, I dated him. And I was raised a Baptist. And I was always trying to convince him that our dates should go to places like the movie theater or the roller skating rink. But I couldn't dance, and I couldn't play cards, and I didn't go into alcohol joints, and drive-in theaters were out. And I had a pretty strict standard that I wanted to live by. And we went roller skating for a while, and we went to movies for a while. But one night, he convinced me that we should go into this dance hall in his hometown. And I knew I shouldn't be in there. I tried to convince him I had no business going in that place. We went through the door, and they stamped my hand because I was a minor. And we found a table, and it was smoky in there, and it was dark, and I couldn't see. And he found a table, we sat down, and as my eyes adjusted to the darkness in there, 2 tables over from where we were sitting was 5 members of the Baptist church. And I kept saying, I can't believe they're here. I can't believe they're here, and I can't believe they're smoking. And some of them were drinking, and I couldn't believe that. And when the music started, they got up and danced. And I was just shocked. But I sat there and I thought, people don't do what they say. They don't, they have convictions, but they don't live those convictions. And so I learned that there was a different way of life to live. And from then on, my life changed. As I was dating him through my senior year of high school, we would come down to his hometown. Our towns were about 9 miles apart. And we would come down and we would go to the restaurant for supper. And it seemed like practically every time he would get called away to the telephone. And when he'd come back, I would ask who called, and he would say it's his mom. And I said, well, what did she need? And he said she just wanted to know if I was eating, who I was with, and when I would be home. And I thought it was really strange. He was 24. He was a few years older than me. And he had already served in the military, so I knew his mother couldn't have possibly called him to find out if he was eating and where he was and when he was coming home in the military. So I thought something was quite wrong with his mother, that she seemed to have to know where he was all the time. So I just watched that observantly, and he was drinking. He seemed like he always had some alcohol in the trunks of his car, but all of his buddies were drinkers. I didn't give that too much thought. I thought just different way of life for people. Not something I was used to, but it'd be okay. Not a problem. And he drank, and there was times when he was quite drunk when we were dating. There was one night when we got pulled over by an officer, and he was, Mark, and my husband spoke last night, and his name's Mark. He's the bald-head guy up the front table up here. We got pulled over that night, and the officer said, "You've been drinking?" And Mark said, "Yeah." And he said, well, he looked in the window, and he looks over at me, and he said, "Can you drive a Chrysler?" And I'm thinking, this is a Chevrolet. Why would he want me to drive a Chrysler? I said, "Well, I can drive. I have a license." He said, "Well, this young man's been drinking." He said, "You need to take the wheel and let him be the passenger." And I got to thinking about this, and this is little rural Kansas, and I think maybe that officer might have been a little intoxicated that night too, because he couldn't even distinguish the type of car we were in. So I drove that night, and I tried to drive most of the times when he was drinking. We dated through that senior year, like I said, and we were planning on getting married in April. And we had the wedding set. We were going to get married in the Baptist church. And I had my wedding dress. And we had gone and got our blood tests to get our marriage license. And Friday, we were supposed to pick up the marriage license. And Thursday night, I walked up to the courthouse. I had no phone. I wasn't raised with all those things. I didn't really know how to talk on a telephone. Got me into trouble sometimes. I walked up to the courthouse square and went to the phone booth, and I called down to his parents' house to find out what time he was going to come up on Friday to go pick the license up. And his mother answered the phone, and she said that he wasn't there, and she didn't know what time he'd be able to come up. And I asked where he was. She said no, she couldn't tell me. So Friday came, and he didn't show. Friday morning, and by late Friday afternoon, I thought I got to get up there and get that license because we're getting married Saturday, and we need that license Saturday morning. So I went on up to the courthouse and I picked up the license. My mother had signed permission for me to marry, and so I had the license, and I was all ready for the wedding on Saturday. I went to the wedding, waited, and waited, and waited, and he didn't show. He missed that wedding. I didn't know where he was. His mother would not tell me. I knew something was wrong with his mother. I really got the idea that somehow she had him locked away up in an upper room. And see, I lived in this little trailer house that had 2 bedrooms, and he's an only child. And he lived in this 13-room house with all these rooms in it. So I figured she had him locked away. My mother came to me and she said, "I think I need to have a talk with you." And so Mom and we went and sat down, and Mom said, I think you need to know, the way things are working. His parents came and waited for me after work one night, and they told me that they wanted me to break you guys up, and I told them that I would do no such thing, that the kids have their life to live, and I'm not going to do a thing to break them up. And his parents don't think you should be together. I thought, oh, okay, that explains why he didn't show at the wedding. Now I know they have something to do with him not being there, but I didn't know where he was. So I went back to school on Monday morning, and for 3 weeks I didn't know where he was. And about 3 weeks I got a stack of letters about 4 inches thick in the mail, and he had written me a letter every day. And he was locked in the black ward of a veterans hospital in Topeka, Kansas. These letters, I had to try to decipher what he was saying in them, because there was parts of letters that were just blacked out with permanent marker. You couldn't make out what the sentence was. So I kind of had to guess what he was saying. And there was no indication of when he was going to get out of there. But I knew from the letters, from the stack of letters, that it was going to be okay. That when he got out, whenever that was, he would come back and we would get married. And I finished high school. I graduated from high school on Tuesday night. And early Wednesday morning, there was a knock on my door. And I got up, and my brother was at the door. And he said, and he lives in Topeka, Kansas, my brother did. And he said, Mark is down by the creek. He said, I drove him up. Well, I just shot out the door and ran down to the creek in my baby doll pajamas that I got for a graduation gift. And my mother wasn't too happy about that. But I found him. And we went back to the house, and I packed a suitcase and got my wedding dress, the marriage license, and we left. We left Kansas. We crossed the border into Nebraska, and we hid out in the cornfields. He was an escapee, and they were out looking for him. And I certainly didn't want to talk to his mother and father. So we hid out in the cornfields for the next 3 days. And we snuck back over into Kansas on Saturday morning, and we found a judge that would marry us. And he looked at our license, and he said, this license is expired, but I see that your mother has signed for your permission to marry. He said, so I'm going to go ahead and marry you. And once the vows are said, he said, then it's legal. So the judge married us on an expired license. And we went back down to his hometown. We got his clothes, and we told his parents that we were married. And his mother said to him, now you'll know how to do it the next time. That's all she said. We packed up the car, and we left Kansas, and we went to Iowa. We started our married life in the far eastern side of Iowa, and things went well for a while. He said he wasn't going to drink. He was married now. He was going to be responsible, and we got a little trailer house, and we started up our married life. And somewhere about the 4th month, I got pregnant, and a couple months later, I woke up to the Star Spangled Banner on the TV set. And that's how the TV would go off the air back then. And I woke up, when you're pregnant, you're sleepy, you fall asleep all the time. And I had fallen asleep, and the door was open, TV was off the air, the car was gone, and Mark was gone. So I waited until it got light, and he never came home. And about 6 o'clock in the morning, as the sun started coming up, I thought, well, I'll walk down to the waterfront. He always seems to be consoled by the waterfront. And I thought I'd find him sitting down there watching the sunrise. And as I was walking, my landlord came up beside me, and he said, the jail just called, and your husband is in jail. So he drove me over to the jail, and I was sitting there waiting for them to bring Mark out. And they did. They brought him out, and I was shocked. I couldn't believe that this was the man I'd married. He looked awful. They had hit him on the back of the head, and he lost control of his bladder. So he smelled bad, and he had vomited down the front of himself, or somebody had vomited on him, but he didn't look good, and he smelled bad, and I thought, I can't believe this. I was told to go over to the courthouse and wait, because they would bring all the guys over for their little hearing that morning. So I went over to the courthouse, and I was sitting in the back of the courtroom on a bench. There wasn't anybody else in the courtroom, and pretty soon a man walks in, and he came back by me and sat down, and he asked me why I was there. And I told him that my husband had resisted arrest the night before. They just wanted to drive him home, but he wouldn't let him. And so he's going to come before the judge that morning. And yeah, I'm about 4 months pregnant, and we're expecting our first child. And I filled him in on our whole situation. My husband was temporarily retired from the military on a disability, and he was drinking the night before, and he shouldn't have been drinking on top of the medication that he was on. And this man talked to me and very patient. And finally he excused himself and said he had work to do. He left the room. A few minutes later, all these guys come over from the jail. The back door of the courtroom opened, and in walks the man that was talking to me in a black robe, and he walks behind the bench. He was the judge. He knew all of our story, my side of it anyway. And the long and short of that story is that Mark got fined $50 and had to pay that in cash. And we were allowed to walk to the bank to get the cash. We didn't have a lot of money, but we did have $50. So on the way to the bank, I asked what I thought was a real logical question. I asked him where the car was, and he said he didn't know. And what do you mean you don't know? And I knew nothing about blackouts. He wanted to go find the car, and I said, no, we're going to go get the money and pay the fine, and then we will walk and try to find the car. So I won that one. We went and got the money, we paid the fine, and then we started walking around Fort Madison, Iowa, looking for a car. We finally found it in front of one of the bars. The keys were still in it. We drove the car back to the trailer house. We loaded it up with all of our possessions, and we left that town and that side of the state. And that is the story of our life for the first 6 years. The geographic cures. We would move when a problem arose and things got bad. We would load up the car and we would move. Children came along. We were still moving with the first 2 kids. We left Fort Madison. We moved to Council Bluffs, Iowa. Within 6 months, I think it was 4 months after the birth of our first child, our son, we left the Iowa-Nebraska border. We went to Canada, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and they didn't really want us up there. So we ended up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. We were always seeking some sort of medical help for what was called his nervous disorder from the military. In Eau Claire, Wisconsin, we were there 2.5 years, and he underwent extensive psychiatric care and mega doses of electric shock treatment for depression. We had our second child in Eau Claire, and even by this time I could see, looking back, how my life was really starting to center around the alcoholic, and the focus was more on the alcoholic, even with raising 2 small children. 2.5 years in Eau Claire, life did not get any better, and we eventually left there and moved back to Kansas, where I was from. And we found a farmer that needed somebody to stay on his farm to just watch his machinery. And we thought that was ideal. We were living on $157 a month. We had 2 children. And Mark was needing to drink daily. And on that farm, for a while, he was making his own homebrew balloon wine, and we were existing. And we weren't living; we were existing. We had 8 gallons of balloon wine brewing on the cabinet, and I'll describe this because it really is quite funny looking back, but it wasn't funny at the time. We didn't have company that comes by our home anymore. So we had these 8 gallons of wine brewing on the cabinet. And we tried those, he tried those little dime balloons, those 10-cent balloons. And the balloons, the theory is that the balloons are supposed to expand with this grape juice, yeast and sugar and water. And then when the balloons would go down, then the wine was ready to drink. So he would start a gallon every day. So he'd have one ready because it took about 7 days for the wine to be ready. And so these 7-cent balloons would go up, and sometimes they just couldn't stand to go up anymore, and they would blow up. And they would have these purple spots all over the ceiling and the wall in our kitchen. And so he got this bright idea that he would go to the family planning clinic and get their balloons and put them on the jugs. And so we had these different phases of expansion in our kitchen on these jugs. I wish I had had my camera. I didn't have a camera. I wished I had a camera then. I still have the recipes for those balloon wines in my recipe box, though. The family planning clinic's balloons didn't break. They lasted. I wasn't handling life very well on that farm. I was coping. I had 2 little children, and I was coping by eating. And then somewhere along the way, I began to start getting physically ill. I don't know, my system just, like every 3 weeks, I would be getting sick. And it was, I thought it was like I was getting the flu all the time. Every 3 weeks, I'd be getting ill. And in that farmhouse, it wasn't much of a farmhouse. I mean, it was a place with a roof over our head, but there was mice and there was rats. I'd seen rats on the back porch and in the back bathroom. If you closed that door, it would build up an odor in there, so we always kept that door open so that it didn't get so strong in there. But I was sick a lot on that farm. And I know Mark told last night about I coped by eating, which I did, and so I got the brainstorm. I'd go to my little family doctor and I'd get something to help me lose the weight because I do not like being overweight. And so he gave me some little heart-shaped pills, and I think they were called Dexedrine. And so I started to take them. Well, the very first day I took one, I didn't need to sleep. I stayed up. I had work to do. I could do work. Everybody else went to bed. I cleaned the house. I had a couple of baskets of laundry that needed to be needed ironed. So I got the ironing board out and I sat that up and I started ironing my baskets of clothes, and I finished them, and I thought, well, 6 o'clock, I really ought to get about an hour's sleep anyway before the kids get up. And so I went to bed. And when I got up, a couple hours later, I looked at the ironing, and there was a dining room that had windows on 3 sides of the dining room, and I'd hung all the clothes on the curtain rods. And I looked at the clothes, and I saw, to me, it looked like I had not even turned the iron on, that everything was wrinkled and just hung on hangers. And I knew that Dexedrine made me out of control, and I don't like that feeling of being out of control. I don't think most Al-Anons like the feeling of being out of control. That's why we belong to Al-Anon. So I did not take any more of those Dexedrine. I can't stand being out of control. I mean, that same thing happened on that half a can of Colt 45. First time I drank I remember my thinking back then is I will drink a can for every can he drinks. And this 6-pack, he will only get 3 because I will have drank 3. Well, I didn't make it past a half. And I was inebriated and out of control. That's why I didn't drink anymore. So I didn't take any dextrine anymore either. But I was still getting sick. And around about mid-November, Mark came into bed one night and he said, I just watched a movie on TV. It's called The Days of Wine and Roses. And he said, and I'm an alcoholic. I got to quit drinking. And I just said, yeah, I know. Come to bed. And the next day, he decided he'd dump out all the alcohol and not drink anymore. And he did that. And later on that day, he began to act quite bizarre. I didn't know what was going on with him. I didn't know what was wrong. He kept talking about caterpillars crawling on the wall. And he talked about caterpillars on me and on him. And I knew something was wrong. So I made a pot of coffee and I made him sit down and drink a pot of coffee. I finally got him to go to sleep. And we went to bed that night. And the next morning we woke up and he was much worse, scary. And I knew I needed to get him some medical care. So I got him in the car and I took him to a little town about 50 miles away to a hospital. I do not know who took care of the children. There's a couple of times in my life where I was so focused on the alcoholic that I can't tell you who took care of our kids, who watched them. I don't know. I know they were taken care of. But I got Mark to this Catholic hospital and they checked him in and put him in bed, and I stayed there with him. He wasn't very happy. They gave him some shots of stuff, and later that day when the nurse came in to bring his supper tray, he attacked the nurse. It was one of the RNs, the nuns, and at that time they wore the white nursing outfits. And he attacked her, and I got called into the administrator's office. So I went down to the administrator's office, and this man says, your husband is going to be a problem here. I mean, we believe that he is going through the delirium tremens, that he has the DTs, and he's a chronic alcoholic. And he needs somebody with him 24 hours a day while he's going through this. He said, our staff is not equipped to handle it. And I said, I don't know what to do. I said, I've been up with him for 3 days now, and I got little kids at home. He said, I know, but he said, I just want to present something to you. He said, in the past, we've had members of AA come to the hospital and sit with people like your husband while he's going through these DTs. He said, I just need your permission. I didn't know what AA was, had no clue. And I gave my permission. And I went back up to Mark's room and I sat outside of his room because he was so angry and they had him sedated. And I was sitting out there outside of his room and 2 men showed up at the hospital. And they just introduced themselves quickly and then went on into his room. And they closed the door. And I sat in the hallway of that hospital while outside of Mark's room thinking, somehow this is my fault. I didn't know how, but I felt it was my fault. I thought that when I married him, that I could just get him away from his mother, and I could make things better, and it would be different. He wouldn't have the problems that he had. And I felt it was my responsibility, the things that happened and had come to this. And I thought those guys who were in there probably telling him that he wasn't cut out for married, that was too much stress, he probably ought to move on with his life. And I just had all kinds of things going through my head, thinking how it was going to be and what was going to happen. And they were in there probably 15 or 20 minutes before one of them came out to talk to me, but it felt like it was hours that they were in there. But one of them came out of his room and said that they were alcoholics from AA and that they were sober and that they were going to stay with my husband. And I could go on home to my kids. But when Mark was released from the hospital, they said they would like him to come to AA and they would like me to come to Al-Anon. I didn't know what Al-Anon was, but anything to help my husband, I would do. I said, absolutely, I'd be glad to go. So when Mark was released from the hospital, we would drive 50 miles every Wednesday night back to that town to go to a AA and an Al-Anon meeting. And I went into my first Al-Anon meeting, and there were 5 women there, and they suggested that I come to 6 meetings. And so I said, okay, I come to 6 meetings. And like I said, that was somewhere about mid-November, right before Thanksgiving, and then Christmas in December. I sat down and I didn't see a one day at a time book or any literature in there. But what I did remember seeing and observing was one of the women opened her purse and she took out a recipe that she was going to make for Thanksgiving. And she started sharing that recipe with the other ladies. And one of the women said something about her husband was having trouble staying sober. And then there was some conversation going on about they're alcoholics and them staying sober or not staying sober. And a lot of sharing of the recipes. And but I came back. The 5th meeting, they were still sharing recipes because it was getting close to Christmas. That 5th meeting, one of the AA members knocked on the door and opened it up a crack and said, we're having an open AA meeting next week, and we'd like you guys to join us for the open AA meeting. So they agreed. And so I came back for my 6th meeting, and I went to an open AA meeting, and I sat in that open AA meeting, and I was impressed. I listened to alcoholics that were staying sober, and they were sharing their experience, strength, and hope, what they had been through, and how they were staying sober. And I thought, this is what I need to be hearing. I need to be hearing how alcoholics are staying sober, what they do to stay sober. I need to help my alcoholic. My alcoholic still wasn't staying sober, even when we were going to those meetings. So shortly after the first of the year in January, I said to my husband, I think AA can work for you, but we need to go someplace where they have AA meetings every day of the week. And you could go to a meeting every day, and you could stay sober. And so we loaded up our car, and we left that farmhouse. By the time we hit Nebraska, I was ill again. And when we made it to Lincoln, I needed care, and we went to the emergency room. And we spent our last of our money. I think we had $37, and that went on medication for me. And we were directed to the family mission in Lincoln, and we moved into the family mission. Mark, me, and 2 kids. And the mission, they nursed me back to health, and they kept care of the kids. And they threw Mark out because he was drinking. He had some alcohol in the trunk of the car. And so he was out on the streets of Lincoln drinking. When I got my health back, I contacted my father-in-law and asked him to wire me some money. And I found a little apartment and moved me and the kids into the apartment. And Mark was out on the streets drinking. I got a job. I started working to support us. And I found a Saturday night AA meeting, open meeting. And I started going to that open meeting. And Mark was welcome at home, but he didn't feel he could stay home and drink at the same time. But when he was home, he would go to the open meeting with me. And I would sit in that open meeting, and when he was with me, he'd sit beside me, and as the experience, strength, and hope was being shared, I would elbow him if I thought he wasn't listening, because I knew he needed to hear what was being said. And I would take mental notes of things that I would remind him of later, because I knew he was going to need to know it. You see, he had 51, we'd calculated at one point, but he had 51 shock treatment. And shock treatment erases your memory. And so I didn't think he had the brain cells to remember things the way he needed to remember them. So I needed to be that for him. I bought him his first big book and some of the other books, and always trying to help him. I planted literature around the house. I knew the bathroom was an ideal place to plant it because he could read it in there and nobody would observe him reading it. It was a little bit more freedom to read in there. I'd slip some under his pillow. I wanted to make sure he had access to everything that he needed to get that program. When he would drink, and he did drink off and on, I would be the one that would call Alcoholics Anonymous and get help for my husband. And they'd usually send somebody out to talk to him, somebody to take him to meetings. But I was a regular at that Saturday night open AA meeting, whether Mark was home or not. And being such a regular, by 1976, they were opening a central office, an AA central office in Lincoln, and they needed an office manager. And I was approached by some of the old-timers suggesting that I apply for that job. And so I did. I put in an application, I went for the interview, and I got hired as office manager of the job. So I was working there almost a year. When Mark decided in March of '77 that he couldn't live with drinking and he couldn't live without it, and decided to take his life, he attempted suicide. He almost succeeded. He made it home that night. He passed out on the living room floor, and I was so mad at him. I decided that I was not going to get him help, and I paced that living room. My kids were asleep in bed, and we had 3 children by now. I remember stepping over him and kicking him because I was so mad that he did this again. I'm working in the central office. The least you can do is stay sober. Really make me look bad. And I did that pretty much all night until about 6 o'clock in the morning, when I believe I had a moment of spiritual experience, a moment of clarity, call it what you will. But I had a presence that came into that living room that said, you don't have a right to let this life go, you can do something and you must. And the first thought that came to my head was call Alcoholics Anonymous. Most people would call 911. I call AA. I called Jack, and Jack came out, and I saw a look of total shock on Jack's face. His face was just white. He took a look at Mark, and I couldn't tell him what Mark had done. I didn't know what he had done. Jack was little, and Mark was pretty good size, and Jack went to the phone and called Dick, and Dick got out there, and the 3 of us got him in the car and took him off to the Veterans Hospital. I got him there, and it was too late to pump his stomach. He was in a coma. Again, I don't know who watched the kids. A neighbor, I don't know if somehow in my thoughts I called a neighbor to come be with the kids or what. I don't know. I sat at the hospital, and they gave me a good chewing out for waiting so long. And Mark was in intensive care, and he had a lot of tubes on him, and he was in a coma. And I sat there all day that Tuesday, thinking about an Al-Anon group that met downtown. It's called the Midtown Al-Anon group. And as I sat there throughout the day, I kept thinking, you really need to go to that meeting, because you were ready to let him die last night. And at 7 o'clock that night, I found myself down in that church, walking the halls trying to find the Al-Anon meeting.
I finally found it, and I went in the door. But before I went in the door, I remember my thinking was that I hope there's nobody in this Al-Anon group that knows who I am. That's really a crazy thought, because those Al-Anons attended that open AA meeting on Saturday night. Many of them had asked me to come to the Al-Anon meeting, had invited me to come, offered to pick me up to take me, and I always had a pat answer that everything was fine. You know, Mark was sober, he's doing well, you know, everything's fine. And I never went. But that night I found myself walking into that Al-Anon room. And I walked in, and over half of the room knew who I was. Some of them had come into the office and bought literature for the meetings that they go to. A lot of them knew me. And they didn't, they just said, welcome. We knew you would eventually make it. And I went into the room and I sat down, and I was a basket case that night. I shared that my husband was in a coma. He was out in the hospital. They didn't know if he would live. I was supposed to call his parents. I cannot call his parents. I couldn't. I didn't. I couldn't bring myself to do that. I sat in that meeting, and by the end of the meeting, what I felt was I finally found people that understood. I finally feel like there's hope. Not necessarily for the alcoholic, but there's hope for me. And I left that meeting, and I went back out to the VA hospital, and I prayed that my husband would live. They told me they didn't know if he would come through that. By late Wednesday night, Mark came out of a coma. He was furious. He did not want to be alive. He pulled the cords out of him, all the tubing out of him. The Veterans Hospital, for some reason or other, don't even put clothes on you. They just cover you with a sheet. He threw that sheet off, and he got out of that bed, and he took off down the hallways with not a stitch of clothes on. He had 2 orderlies, a doctor and his wife, chasing him down the hallways of the Veterans Hospital. He went down a flight of stairs, down another corridor of the hospital, up another flight of stairs, out a door of the hospital, onto the lawn. All of us following him out of the hospital. The doctor brought a blanket out with him and gave him a blanket and convinced him to come back into a little room. Mark was furious. He didn't want to be alive. He said he would do it again, and next time he would take me with him. And so I was directed to go down to the county attorney and file commitment. And so I am the spouse of an alcoholic that filed commitment papers on my alcoholic. I went down to the county attorney. It was not what I wanted to do. I didn't like how his parents had treated him when we were dating. They had committed him to the VA hospital. And I had promised Mark I would never do that to him, ever. And here I was at the county attorney's office doing exactly to him what had been done to him 10 years before. And I filed commitment papers, and he was sent away for an indefinite period of time. And I started going back to the Al-Anon meeting every Tuesday night. There was no guarantees that he would come back home, or he'd want to come back home even. But as we came to find out, alcoholism affected all of our family. We needed to find a way to grow together, or we definitely were going to grow apart. And I had never known Mark without, some sort of alcohol or tranquilizer or some sort of chemical to keep him stable. He eventually came back from the institution, and he got a sponsor, and I had gotten a sponsor. I got the woman to be my sponsor that I did because she was still living with active alcoholism, and I was not so sure that I wouldn't be living with active alcoholism. So I needed somebody that understood how to do that, how to live with active alcoholism. And that is the reason I got the woman to be my sponsor. Her husband never did sober up. He had died. He died out as an alcoholic. But she was a tremendous asset to me. Mark came back from the institution, and we had many talks. And we would go on what we called our Friday night dates, because not knowing each other without chemicals, we had to learn to know each other all over again, or from this very start with 3 kids. And we would go to a Friday night meeting, and then we would go out for dinner, and we would go on long walks together and just talk and get to know each other. And we learned early on that it was very important for us both to have programs and to use our sponsors. Like walking down a railroad track, him on one track and me on the other. And if we got unsteady, we could reach out and touch hands and continue to walk. But we needed to be on our own programs, walking this way of life. And so in 1977, sobriety entered our home, and recovery in AA and Al-Anon entered our home. We eventually had 2 daughters that went to Al-Anon and were in Al-Anon for a number of years and active in service in Al-Anon. The sponsor that I got, and I didn't know at the time, was involved in service. She began to start asking me to come with her to district meetings. She would come by the house and pick me up, and we would go to the district meetings. And I didn't know anything about, the service part of the program. But because she was involved in service, I was going to get involved in service. So I would follow Vivian to the district meetings and to the area meetings. And eventually by 1987, I was serving, I began serving as delegate for Nebraska. I had served at the district level. I had served as coordinators, some of the different coordinators at the area level, and as alternate delegate. And I started serving as the delegate to the World Service Conference in 1987 on panel 27. In 1987, our co-founder, Lois Wilson, was still alive. And Lois still lived in her home, Stepping Stones. And so I got the opportunity to go out to Stepping Stones when Lois was still living at her home and sit down and talk to her for a short time. Lois told many of us delegates at that time that she was 61 years old when she started Al-Anon. And she said, she had no clue that Al-Anon would become as large as it is and be as in many countries as it is. But she said, anyone can start something. She said, anyone can start something. But it takes all of you to carry it out, to keep it going. And that was like a challenge to me, that I had a responsibility to keep the fellowship going, to keep the program alive. And I got to see her the next year at conference, and then she passed away the following fall. And I was at her memorial in 1989. I feel like I've really been blessed to be able to see our founder. And she was such a humble woman, but such a wise woman. And she didn't like a lot of accolade. She was very humble. But I went back to Lincoln, Nebraska, and I've throughout the years I've sponsored many Al-Anon members. I've started new groups. I've done a lot of public outreach. Served at the area level as chairman. I've raised my children. We've had sobriety in the home. We've had so many wonderful things that have gone on in our life. By 2002, I was at one of the delegates meetings, regional delegates meetings. I believe it was being held in Lincoln, Nebraska. And our trustee was given her report, and she was talking about the need for Al-Anon members to serve as trustee at large. And I had a woman sitting next to me that had served as trustee at large. And during this report, she was saying we needed Al-Anon members that were willing and that had the time to do this, to serve as trustee, to submit resumes for that position. And I wasn't giving it a whole lot of thought, but this woman next to me, she elbows me and she said, you submit a resume, you can do that. I said, well, I'm not qualified, I don't have any education. She said, you have Al-Anon experience. I thought, well, yeah, I do, I have Al-Anon experience. I said, I'm a high school graduate. That's as far as I've gotten with education. She said, it doesn't matter. So she planted the seed. And I went home and I talked to my family. Wanted to see how they felt about that, how much support would they be able to give me. And surprisingly, they were all behind it, going to be very supportive. And so that really made me get to thinking that maybe I ought to consider that. And so I found myself submitting a resume. Just submitting the resume, no guarantees there. And a year later, I was contacted to come in and do a 10-minute talk before the Board of Trustees. And I did that. And then there was like 6 of us that were called to come in. And they only needed 2. So, that still isn't very much percentage chance of getting that. So, but I wasn't home about a week, and I got a phone call, and I was one of them that was selected. So I found myself going to serve as trustee at large on the board of directors of Al-Anon Family Group. And it was a trip that it was worth every effort, every second that I put into it. I served 6 years as a trustee at large. Served on a number of committees at the World Service Office, was the treasurer for 3 years, and I was on the executive committee for 4 years. After my term as trustee at large was over, I continued on the executive committee another year and was asked to chair the International Coordination Committee, which I did, and that took me to Moscow, Russia, and Barcelona, Spain, and Paris, France, and Helsinki, Finland, all trying to strengthen the structures in those countries. And I will forever be grateful for Al-Anon for giving those opportunities to me. There's a quote that one of the delegates from Finland said when we was at the international meeting, International Al-Anon General Services meeting in Helsinki. The delegate from Finland, he said, if I know the steps, I don't have to commit suicide. If I know the traditions, I don't have to commit homicide. And if I know the concepts, I don't have to commit a massacre. And I thought about that and how many ways that we damage lives, and sever relationships, and Al-Anon has given me the tools to not have to damage lives and not have to damage relationships. In fact, it's given me the tools to build relationships. That mother-in-law that I had a very difficult time, it wasn't until after our second child was born before she finally accepted that this marriage was going to work, and maybe she ought to get behind it. Then she got us a wedding gift. But in her final days, my husband and I were her caregivers. We were there for her to do everything for her that she couldn't do for herself anymore. And I don't think I could have done that if I hadn't had Al-Anon and had the tools to work through the resentments that I had towards her. There's been lots of life situations that we've had to walk through. As I was serving as trustee at large in 2005, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I went through the surgery and had double mastectomy and reconstruction, and went through chemotherapy. And chemotherapy's, it's not a fun deal, it's a bad deal. Chemo's very strong drugs. And to this day, I have health problems as a result of going through chemotherapy. I have a heart that's been affected by chemo, and I'm on heart medication for that. Last February, I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer and had to have a total thyroidectomy. 2 weeks later, my husband was diagnosed with stage 4 bladder cancer. And he started chemotherapy the 1st of April. At the end of April, my mother was diagnosed with liver cancer, and 8 days later, she died in our home on hospice from liver cancer. I'm the 7th child in my family. My mother had designated me as her executor to the estate in her will. So this summer has been an extremely trying summer. I have 6 older brothers and sisters that not all of them, but some of them have made it very difficult, finding it probably very hard for them to accept why Mother asked me to do this. But she did, and she knew, and my mother knew why she was selecting me. What is really ironic about my whole life, in 1985, we went to the International in Montreal, and this totally shocked me, but my husband invited my mother to come to the International in Montreal. My mother doesn't go to Al-Anon or AA, but, he had such a love for my mom. My mom was more like a mother to him than his mother. But he invited my mother to come along, and she accepted it. She came with us to the International. And she saw what this program done for all of those people in that stadium on Saturday night. She witnessed all those alcoholics and family members and the recovery that they had. And so she knew what our programs did for us. After she died, I was going through some of the different boxes and storage stuffs that my mom had. And I came across a One Day at a Time book and a 12-Step and 12 Tradition book that my mom had. I never got a chance to ask her where she got it or when she got it or how she got it, but she had one. With my husband having stage 4 cancer, I have got the opportunity to watch him walk through this. He has a wonderful attitude, and I know it's the program that's given that. And the support that we have from the people in the program was there when I went through cancer, and it's there while he's going through it. And he may not come through this, but that's okay, because God gave us 34 years from another disease, the disease of alcoholism. I am so grateful for the program. And I don't think I have anything more to say. My voice did survive. I hope you understood what I said. And I'm grateful to be here. Thank you.